Aion. Hope you're all doing well today. Let's get into this first. Sorry, I got to reuse that same beat. I only have this two beats, but I'm having too much fun with those. Side note: if anybody ever wants to make like a little intro video, just use PowerPoint. Just go into PowerPoint, put an image you want to use. You can use a GIF image like that, right? Just like a moving image. Put it in the PowerPoint. Save it. Just Google image search different GIFs or whatever. Save one you like. You have to save it though and insert it as a picture. If you just copy and paste it, it'll copy it as like a hard picture, not as a moving picture. So if you save it as a GIF file and then upload it into your PowerPoint, and then you can add your like first click is the first thing, then the second click is the subtitle. Put some music there. Boom, save that. You got a little intro video. So I don't know why I thought that I should explain that here, especially since you're going to be watching this out of order, and might be watching this kind of deep into the course. Carl Jung writes, this is a book that like I would highly recommend to all of you. It's called Portable Jung. That there is a series of portable books, and like I just wanted to show you quick. So like, yeah, it's like they did one for Milton, Nietzsche, Plato, Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, Shakespeare, Oscar Wilde, Walt Whitman, Voltaire, Mark Twain, Tolstoy, Bernard Shaw, right? So it's like what they do, what it is like the collection of their important essays usually. And what we're going to be looking at today is this like one that a lot of people consider some of Jung's one of his most difficult topics. He goes into this idea of Aion, or what he calls the he has the same title subtitle like Aion, Phenomenology of Self. And to understand this idea, it's like Aion was this Hellenistic deity that represented, it's what that image is there, represented this concept of boundless time, whereas Kronos was the god of, well, it's where we get the word chronological, was the god of chronological, structured, ordered, measured time. And so Aion is this idea of like, well, this Hellenistic god, and the Hellenistic refers to the time period in Greece. I'm going to talk a little bit about this as it goes. And remember Carl Jung, and remember it's kind of interesting. I want you to, and if you've been listening to some of the content, and or if you've been my student for a while, which a lot of you have, you'll know that I like am really interested in this relationship between Jung and Freud, right? It's in a lot of ways the most interesting interpersonal relationship in the history of psychology. It's like the founder of psychology and his prize student, who then they have this breakup of the relationship largely over this fact that Jung's going into this mythical stuff. So anytime I'm talking about this and you're like, Aion, like, why is he making this link to like Greek mythology or whatever? It's like, just picture Freud behind me, just like upset. And like, that's like what Freud, he was almost like in the letters to Jung, quite literally begging him not to go down this route. Don't go down this route. You're going to get lost into the occult mythical past. He like was begging him to stick with the psychosexual model, this biogenetic almost model. Yeah, so Aion, it's like, sorry, I'm already almost 5 minutes in and I haven't even really what given a good explanation for Aion is the zodiac. Aion is cycles of time. Chronos is recorded time. Aion is the fact that this recorded time even is in cycles. Yeah, it's if you're interested in that, just research the Aion. And then so he's using this obviously metaphorically as a way of talking about, well, the unconscious and the relationship between the self and the ego. And he's talking about how his sorry if my eye contact's weird. I'm just, it's a little bit easier to read this off. I'm sitting in the big chair, I already made this point in a few videos, but my back's been bugging me a bit, my shoulders a bit tight, so I'm just sitting in the more comfy chair or whatever. It's like I'm not winning any beauty contests anyways. So let's just see, like that's a point where if I was doing this in a pre-recorded PowerPoint, I'd probably start that slide over because I went a little bit off script there. But I think I'm gonna just roll with it because not because Aion is this notion that there's a difference between who we think we are and who we really are. That there's a difference between the self and the ego. There's a difference between our social mask, our persona, who I'm trying to be, and who I am. And the more calm we can be, and the more we fall into ourselves, and the more we can, well, find a synchronicity, to use his language, between those aspects of self. It's like, so let me just, to not get too rambly, read his quote here. He's saying that like his investigation of psychology of the unconscious confronted him with facts that required the formulation of new concepts. Like I'm studying this stuff, and to understand it and to really make sense of it, I'm speaking as young, remember, because he's looking at Freud stuff, and remember Freud. It's so easy to critique Freud, but Freud's laying the foundation and drawing this at first lower resolution map that's going to get more and more higher resolution. And Jung's looking at this and being like, in Jung's investigation of the unconscious, it's almost like he needed a new word, and this word that he's using is self. That it's not just the ego. Now keep in mind that ego is a weird word because we also use it in common language, but some of the earliest work in psychology, some of the earliest psychologists, if you had to said the word psychology or ego psychology, those two terms almost meant the same thing. Like ego psychology, some people called that psychology. It was about like your mind. What is different about you than the next person? Your ego was almost your, and Jung saying that like, okay, but there's something behind that. That is your psychological self, or it's your psychological ego. Sorry, I'm confusing the words, right? But this is why this is a complicated essay. So if you're sitting there shaking your head a bit at like what I'm even talking about, it's like stick around for the next few hours and I'll try to explain it better. But this is kind of the heart of the idea that is caught up in this picture. Jung's model of the psyche. And for the students, I'll always have like the little link you can click to find the source of the picture, because that's a really good image, and it really kind of highlights all the terms we're going to be looking at today. This idea of the persona, the ego, the self, the shadow, the anima, the animus, the conscious, the unconscious, at both the personal and at the collective level, between interpersonal. All right, Carl Jung, let's do this. I've been waiting to do this. Like, Evie went to bed a bit early tonight. I'm gonna try to one shot this whole thing. I don't know, maybe not. I might not. We'll see. I'm only on slide the first like intro part, and I'm already 10 minutes in. I haven't even hit a single video. I hope that you like this course. I don't know. So Jung's saying all I can do is just try to do my best, right? The field of consciousness, that Jung has this idea of, field of consciousness. What we're experiencing as our life. We understand the ego as this complex factor to which all conscious content are related. It forms, as it were, this like, he doesn't say the like, I added that obviously. It forms this field of consciousness, the ego. And insofar as it comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. It has to be conscious to something. You have to be aware of it. If you're not aware of it, it's not consciously present. It has to be conscious to something. What's the something? If you're feeling an emotion and you're like, all upset, and then you do something, and you're like, oh, why was I like that? And it's like, I was overwhelmed by emotion. What was overwhelmed? If you're feeling like you're not yourself, and it's like you can basically, I'm trying to get at this idea that's been in a lot of religions and stuff. It's like, who's the witness? And Jung's starting to present this idea of the word self, that it's different than ego. Our idea of who we are isn't the full picture, because there's aspects of ourself that dip into the unconscious that we'll never be fully aware of. Sorry, this probably doesn't. I'm going to just go full screen on this one because the way I picked the text wasn't the greatest here. Oh, it's actually not that bad when I go full screen. A total description of the personality is, even in theory, absolutely impossible. You don't have to have this all down anyways, but it's just interesting. Oh, as a side note, anytime you see at the bottom there, CW, it's from this book. It's from the collected works. A total description of the personality is, even in theory, absolutely impossible because the unconscious portion of it can't be grasped cognitively. This unconscious portion, our experience has abundantly shown, is by no means unimportant. On the contrary, the most decisive qualities in a person are often unconscious and can be perceived only by others, or have to be laboriously discovered with outside help. Oftentimes, like therapeutic help, therapy. So Jung has this idea, this process of would. I'll go full screen just for another one because it's an image here. This is why I want to try to get good at this StreamYard, and not like, because it's a little bit harder to just maintain your kind of um it's even like just kind of maintain the pacing and everything, and I have to kind of learn how to try to do this live but by myself. um but I like it because it just has some interesting functionality. Anyways, the process of individualization by that Jung talks about is, look at this, like, even if you just look at this really simply at the pictures, you becoming an individual is this understanding that your ego and yourself isn't the same, and that the ego becomes conscious of itself, followed by an awareness of the separate self. This comes to like a really deep idea of Jung's. It's a guy named Michael Tessarian explains this well too. It's this idea called negation. Apophatic knowledge, I think, is another way of saying it, but negation is a philosophical idea that basically means you can't experience what the self is, you can only experience what the self isn't. There's certain things that aren't the self. It's like this idea of like, you almost can't try to be like a real authentic person. You can just like stop being an inauthentic person. And that's if you kind of get what I mean by that. It's, I heard some podcaster say that the other day, but that's like the idea of negation is like the only way you can figure out what your true self is realizing what isn't your true self. What are your patterns? What are your conditioning? Or what is your conditioning? Or like, what is your, um, as some of the stuff we saw in Century of Self, what is your lifestyle? Right? So it's like, and if you haven't, depending on the order you're doing this course, if you haven't watched Century of Self yet, that documentary, they get on this idea of like people being marketed to by like who they think they are lifestyle wise. But that as you move away from the social mask, and as your true self and your social mask become separated, that you become an individual. Right? Individuation. And at this point, We reach our first video clip. Okay, let's check this out. So now, instead of playing it through here, I have these all preloaded. So I think I think I'll just overwrite this one.
Conscious and unconscious do not make a whole when one of them is suppressed and injured by the other. If they must contend, let it at least be a fair fight, with equal rights on both sides. Both are aspects of life. Carl Jung. In my previous video,
I want to say too, I'm gonna like, instead of, I'll see if this gets loaded up nice on YouTube, I'll probably end up putting tags that link to these people's original videos. But I checked, they all have like their little promo thing at the end, so yes, they kind of tag themselves.
About the shadow, I've discussed the world of the unconscious and how we can recognize its manifestations in our behavior. According to Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, the ultimate self-realization is the integration of the unconscious into the conscious. This is called the individuation process.
This guy's called Enzo Ganger. ENZEL.
First of all, thank you Daniel
Ganger.
For your generous PayPal donation, and thank you Matt and Seeking Spire for supporting me on Patreon. I appreciate it very much. Now let's dive in. The process of individuation is complicated. So for making this video, I've tried to simplify the information I found when studying it and combine it with a few observations. Before we get into the individuation process itself, it is essential to clarify the associated elements: the self, the ego, the persona, the conscious and unconscious, the shadow, and the anima and animus. Now, according to Jung, at the core of our personality there's something called the self. The self is the totality of the conscious and unconscious. The problem, however, is that the vast...
It's interesting because this is like the exact picture where, well, not the exact, but I think there's like a couple more. Pretty close though to the exact image.
The majority of the self lies hidden in the unconscious. Part of that unconscious cannot be entered. There's a personal unconscious that consists of all information of an individual's mind which is not readily available, like repressed or forgotten memories about oneself or the environment. There's also a collective unconscious that is basically the same for all human beings and probably shared among all members of a same species. For example, dogs are collectively driven by the same instincts. The same is true for humans. Jung noticed that the human collective unconscious brings forth a series of archetypal figures as well, which are universal symbols that we see in mythologies all across the world. These archetypes tend to appear in dreams too. Examples of these are the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the great mother, and even God. These figures are not fixed archetypes themselves, but rather representations of what lingers in the unconscious in an archaic language that most humans would recognize. I've called these motifs archetypes, and by this I mean forms or images of a collective nature which occur practically all over the earth as constituents of myths and at the same time as autochthonous individual products of unconscious origin, said Jung. Before we dive deeper into the unconscious, I would like to explore the four main elements that we'll find across the conscious and unconscious, which make up the psyche and thus form the self. These are the ego, the persona, the shadow, the anima or animus. The ego rests on the conscious as well as the unconscious and is basically the story we tell ourselves about who we are, which is accumulated over the years by different experiences, but also a direct product of the realization that we are, in a way, separate from others. This realization happens in early childhood, when an infant starts to use the word I. That refers to the ego. The ego is the center of the field of consciousness, but not the center of the personality, since it is still subordinated to the self. The persona is the mask we wear in order to conform to society. We could describe it as the societal role we quote-unquote wear in order to fit in, based on norms and ethics. An example is the
persona. It's like that word of like, obviously what's so interesting is like obviously how close it is to the word person, right? But in Jungian ideas, the persona is like the social mask. So it's like the woman in that, I think, in that image is like obviously wearing a mask, right? So they're using that terminology.
The definition of masculinity and femininity. What does it mean to be a man or a woman? Most cultures and subcultures propose certain criteria for this, and the persona is the product of us meeting these criteria to fit in. The persona is nothing more than a superficial construct of how we want the world to perceive us. The shadow lies in the unconscious and consists of undesirable characteristics that we have repressed and want to keep in the dark. This happens consciously as well as unconsciously. Jung stated that the less the shadow is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. I quote, "If the repressed tendencies, the shadow as I call them, were obviously evil, there would be no problem whatever. But the shadow is merely somewhat inferior, primitive, unadapted, and awkward, not wholly bad. It even contains childish or primitive qualities which would in a way vitalize and embellish human existence, but convention forbids."
See, people get really I think sometimes people misinterpret Jung's idea of the shadow. The shadow basically means repressed energies, right? And Jung gets into like labeling things mythologically a little bit, right? But like it's yeah, I hope through this presentation we kind of, and you'll notice this course is a little Jung heavy, but I think Jung pulls a lot of what I feel like a lot of you have probably already learned, pulls a lot of it together, and he was kind of like set outside the game a little bit or whatever, and I think he really has an ability to pull the field together in a way. That was like just a random freestyled comment, but let's get back to the video.
End quote. Many people aren't even aware that they have a shadow. When parts of it inevitably come to the surface, they tend to brush this off as something outside themselves. I've created a separate video about the shadow. You'll find a link at the top of the screen.
We're going to watch it later.
According to Jung, in every male there's a female, and in every female there's a male, both hidden in the unconscious part of...
Okay, so I love this YouTuber, but I feel like he doesn't nail this perfectly. I think the best way to understand Anima and Animus, and we're going to watch a video on it in a sec, but the dualistic ideas of yin yang. Remember that Jung was heavily influenced by Taoism, heavily influenced by this idea of complementary opposites. Anima Animus.
The psyche. This doesn't mean that we have completely separate human beings inside of us. Rather, it means that men possess characteristics that are classically considered feminine, and women possess characteristics that are classically considered masculine. Jung calls the feminine part of the male the anima, and the masculine part of the female the animus. Now we have created a map of the psyche according to the ideas of Jung. It's time to talk about the individuation process. Individuation is the integration of unconscious elements of the psyche, as far as this is possible, into the wholeness of the personality.
Yeah, so like that's a loaded idea, right? Individuation is the integration of these energies, and I'm not going to get it word for word. You can just rewind that a tiny bit because he says it really nicely, but basically individuation is the integration of these unconscious energies into, well, because he thought that like you could even go to his classic saying that like the point of therapy is sort of to bring some of this these unconscious energies that are unarticulated but able to exert influence, bring them to the light of consciousness, and then they lose their power. And that was kind of the idea of therapy in general.
Generally, this process goes naturally when we get older, but there's also the possibility to stimulate it by forms of intervention like therapy. This means that the ego should, first of all, acknowledge that it is not the center of the psyche and that a great part of who we truly are lurks in the darkness of the unconscious. But if we understand anything of the unconscious, we know that it cannot be swallowed.
But think of how intense that idea is. If the ego is the part of yourself that you experience as yourself, and that's not the center of your psyche, of your mind, that's that yourself, the self. This is where they're talking about like the centrality of self. It's what's in the middle of the diagram or whatever, not your interpretation of, not the persona, ego. The ego and persona aren't the exact same, but again, I'll kind of just show this idea from a bunch of different angles and try to just build this language a little bit. It's a little bit about building the language, and because we're talking about something super complex and something that even in 2021, like, it's still, like, consciousness is still has a mysteriousness to its essence.
We also know that it is dangerous to suppress it, because the unconscious is life, and this life turns against us if suppressed, as happens in neurosis, said Jung. So making the unconscious conscious can never be done in its entirety, because there simply are areas of the psyche that we cannot enter. Part of the individuation process is the integration of the shadow. In a practical sense, this would mean that we should not only become aware of our dark side, we should incorporate it in our conscious personality as well. Exploring the unconscious means that we have to take certain elements of our personality to the surface that aren't pretty. As Jung stated, and I quote, "Individuation is an exceedingly difficult task. It always involves a conflict of duties, whose solution requires us to understand that our counter-will is also an aspect of God's will." End quote. In other words, our dark side...
Right, so he's like, and he's writing in a... Jung is so interesting in how he relates to religion, and I'll try not to go down a path there, but he's saying here, individuation is an exceedingly difficult task, this separation of self and ego. It always involves a conflict of duties whose solution requires us to understand that our counter will, so the part of ourselves that we don't like, is, if we consider the part of ourselves that we like a gift of God, an aspect of God's will to make us that way, so is the part sort of we don't like. Because what he's kind of saying is, when we bury the aspects of ourselves we don't like and the tendencies and all that stuff, there's this repressed stuff has an ability to gain this energetic influence. And if we deny that that exists, right, that you have to somehow integrate that energy.
A conflict of duties, whose solution requires us to understand that our counter-will is also an aspect of God's will. End quote. In other words, our dark side is as valuable as our light side. Another dimension is the confrontation with the contrasexual part of our psyche known as the anima or animus. In many cases, men have not incorporated their feminine aspects in a healthy way, and the same is true for women and their masculine aspects. Chances are high that we have repressed the masculine or feminine side of ourselves in its completeness, which is equivalent to throwing away the baby with the bathwater. The goal here is a healthy integration of the anima or animus, which will actually empower our personalities regardless of what sex we are. There's also the possibility of unhealthy integration, which manifests itself as harmful and negative aspects of the opposite sex. Therefore, toxic masculinity can very much be part of female behavior, and toxic femininity, something less talked about, can be part of male behavior. When it comes to individuation, there's no one-size-fits-all. So it's up to the individual to bring forth the unconscious and decide the necessary steps. Because individuation is in essence a natural process, it cannot be forced within a certain time frame. Self-realization is something that can take a lifetime, and very well may never be completed before we meet the grave.
Oh man, I totally spelt his name wrong, but did he spell his? Oh, I just forgot the I at the beginning. EI. Yeah, this guy makes pretty good videos. It's just with Carl Jung, since he's a little bit more outside the box, a lot of these are people that made these videos. They're like a little more independent videos, but they're like, this guy makes interesting ones about consciousness, that kind of stuff. It really, it's really some interesting content. If I remove this, sorry to be talking while I'm doing this. Right back. Here we go. Okay. Clearly, then, it's a Jung quote. The personality is a total phenomena that does not coincide with the ego, that is, with the conscious personality, but forms an entity that has to be distinguished from the ego. I have suggested calling the total personality, which through the present cannot be fully known, the self. The ego is by definition subordinate to the self and is related to it like a part to the whole. Introduction to the Jungian shadow. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This act is the condition, the essential condition, for any self knowledge, and it therefore, as a rule, meets with considerable resistance. Indeed, self knowledge as a psychotherapeutic measure frequently requires much painstaking work extending over a long period. Again, from the collective works. The shadow has an emotional nature, a kind of a autonomy. Think about this idea of like, if you're ever really mad about something and you feel like almost overwhelmed by being so upset, it's like that mood had almost like a mind of its own. That's what this means, like an emotional nature, almost like it had its own autonomy, its own decision making ability, that it had its own, that it was possessive of you. Again, he's not talking about some kind of demon, he's talking about the ability of these repressed, energetic influences. The shadow represents first and foremost the personal unconscious. So Jung is the person that introduces us to this world of a collective unconscious, right? And he's saying this idea that like there's like, so basically the idea is that there's the unconscious and there's the part of the yourself that you're not aware of, that's specifically you. The shadow's there. Then there's this, he has this idea, and remember, just every time you hear me sounding like I'm going outside of the box, think of like Freud standing in the corner, just like shaking his head, totally mad. And it's kind of, I don't know why, but I think that's a funny thought, because it's like the Anima Animus idea is that lives almost in this like collective group mind, this collective unconscious, whereas the shadow's more the personal unconscious. And keep in mind with these presentations, I'm not asking you to like believe all this stuff hook, line, and sinker. I'm just saying like this is the thought process of one of the giants in the history of psychology. And I think it's like just playing with these ideas and thinking about it and thinking about how it relates to other things. I don't know, is developmental to there's a reason why they call some of these guys depth psychologists, right? Like deep into the nature of self. Next video, the shadow.
Shadow, one could say, is simply the dark area produced by some object coming between rays of light and a surface. But for someone like Carl Jung, the shadow signifies a far more literary personification. The shadow is perceived as an entity of its own that is welded and chained within the realm of our deep unconscious mind, a dark specter that we all possess, but also one too frightening for many people to ever build the courage to face. A specter that can never be defeated, but if tamed can lead to personal cultivation and the evolution of the mind and body. But what is the shadow? According to Jung, the shadow possesses the most inferior characteristics of the psyche that all men try to relinquish. The shadow might be a desire frowned upon by our conscience or peers. It could be a bizarre or unhealthy interest that the powers of civilization have apparently quelled. Shadow contents involve known and unknown aspects of the self, making the ego, the unconscious, and the environment all play a role in its expression or repression. When confronted by the ego, the largely unconscious shadow can be integrated into the consciousness, but for the most part, the shadow lies beyond the threshold of human awareness. It is quite within the possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. It is a frightening thought that man also has a shadow side to him, consisting not just of little weaknesses and foibles, but of a positively demonic dynamism. The individual seldom knows anything of this. To him, as an individual, it is incredible that he should ever in any circumstances go beyond himself. But let these harmless creatures form a mass, and there emerges a raging monster. And each individual is only one tiny cell in the monster's body, so that for better or worse, he must accompany it on its bloody rampages and even assist it to the utmost. Jung also stresses the importance of externalizing shadow material through socially acceptable channels to bring its inherent darkness to light. The ego is able to integrate rather than repress unpleasant unconscious impulses. When merely repressed, the shadow finds a way through the cracks of the psyche and jumps out in disturbing ways. Given that every human being has a wide variety and range of traits, impulses, and emotions, every individual by necessity has a shadow. Some of these characteristics are repressed and hidden, both to oneself and to others. To oneself so that one can navigate through life with the conviction that one is a wholly good and virtuous human being, and to others so that one can fit and succeed socially. Unfortunately, there can be no doubt that man is, on the whole, less good than he imagines himself or wants to be. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. At all counts, it forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meant intentions. When one's shadow is relegated to the depths of the unconscious, it can wreak havoc on one's life in the sense that it will exert unconscious control over one's thoughts, emotions, choices, and actions. As Jung said, that which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. This accounts for the self-destructive behavior so many individuals struggle with and are unable to control.
Just one sec. With that, things that we don't, what was it? Appears as fate. That which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our life as fate. That which we do not bring to consciousness appears as fate. That's pretty deep quote.
Consciousness appears in our lives as fate. This accounts for the self-destructive behavior so many individuals struggle with and are unable to control despite consciously knowing they would be better off not engaging in such actions. The task in life, which thus confronts everyone, according to Jung, is to become conscious of and integrate one's shadow into one's conscious personality, accepting it with open arms, not as an abhorrent aspect of one's life, but as a necessary and vital part of one's being. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The concept of the shadow has been both championed and critiqued among opposing perspectives. Most theologians say we cannot solely rely on ourselves and the limited power of the ego to deal with the shadow. Instead, we must call on the power of God to overcome evil. You can't do it alone. Lean on the Lord, the religious person exclaims. Meanwhile, Jungians warn of a projection trap that some traditional religious person seems to fall into. Jungians tend to say that the sanctimonious individuals in related religious organizations project their own dark impulses onto others instead of facing the evil within themselves. This ugly dynamic may result in scapegoating. Luckily, we have laws in the civilized world to protect people from this kind of primitive mentality. Jung's followers also tend to imply that the spirituality of organized religion only goes as deep as the persona, where individuals play a superficial role of holiness for the sake of appearances and to feel good about themselves. This dynamic might account for a Catholic nun's cruel treatment of children, or the horrifying outbreak of pedophile priests and brothers, or the Islamic caliphate that must permeate itself through the East, and the beheadings of all non-believers tolerated and preached by prominent sheiks. The shadow is never faced by the religious man as a result of ignorance. It is falsely assumed by the religious man that the shadow within him is of a foreign entity, an external enemy ceaselessly attempting to pierce through the heart of the righteous and corrupt all good men. The man forgets that the devil itself is not an outsider, but is harbored deep within a dark fortress inside of his own subconscious. Ironically, according to Jung, we may all need to become the exorcists of our innermost demons. Jung says the shadow must be confronted. When repressed, the shadow lurks like an angry dragon locked up in a dungeon, if not sublimated, which simply means the transformation.
This is I don't know, you're either loving or hating this video. I think this guy is pretty cool because he's obviously got like a script, and he's hitting this pretty interesting, doing a pretty awesome job. One thing I'll tell you though, as he gets near the rant near the end, the pictures on the screen does get pretty flashy. So if you have any like photosensitivity, to be aware of that. And I know some of the content here gets a bit dark, but he does a good job at presenting the general idea here.
Of unwanted impulses into something less harmful, the shadow's sheer power can break free of its chains, causing severe psychological and possibly physical injury. Jung believed that awe-inspiring creativity was conceived once an individual had formed a union or bond with the shadow. The inventive artist who deals with dramatic or foreboding themes, such as the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch, creates works of art that provokes a profound feeling.
Well, because remember, it's like he's got this kind of like dark, mystic tone. He's got an amazing voice for this kind of thing. But like, keep in mind, like the shadow's you. It's just like you're repressed. In Jung's, even in Jung's ideas, like it's your repressed energies is the word, I guess, and yeah, it's like so. But then what is it? It's our anxieties. It's our worries. Our pains, our bad experiences, the things that we wanted to say but didn't say, the things that we wanted to push back against but didn't, everything that we've ever like, and that. So the idea is that it's not like an actual thing, but it's like this like energetic shadow.
Of reverence, terror, and bewilderment. Works of art like this are often critiqued by religious fundamentalists and, in the extreme scenario, tyrants like Adolf Hitler. The shadow gripped Hitler's personality, but he wasn't even dimly aware of its hold on him. His perverse impulses were all misinterpreted as righteousness and truth. In his mind, he was the grand chief of a supposed master race, and everything other was to be eradicated. Hitler mediated the power of the shadow with a disturbing charisma that swayed a great number of otherwise ordinary people into committing unspeakable atrocities. That is the power of an
Oh, I just wanted to wait till the symbolism wasn't as extreme on the screen. I think that it's important, though, to really understand how this all links with World War II. Because what happened in Germany in World War II is one of the clearest examples of mass psychosis. And it's a very essential lesson. Not that like it's one of the worst things that's ever happened. It's essential lesson. What I mean by that is in how things can go wrong.
contained shadow synergized with a zealous magnetism. Indeed, Hitler believed that art should be censored for the greater social good and drew up a hate list of so-called degenerate art. Entartete Kunst, created by artists whom he didn't like. Picasso's work was on his list, along with that of Gauguin, Van Gogh, Chagall, Klee, Kandinsky, and some other 20,000 other artworks. Ironically, this was the
I think there's going to be some pretty tough footage here from Auschwitz that you might want to look down.
very same Hitler who brutally tortured and murdered innocent civilians and who apparently was a coprophiliac, an infantile condition where one becomes sexually aroused when defecated and urinated on. Truly, the shadow's grasp on him was, for lack of better terms, eerily magnificent.
Look at that railgun. Oh my god.
Er sich als Träger seines besten Blutes fühlen und dieses Wissen.
Another way the shadow
And if you're wondering like why I'm showing this like that, because that's clearly Hitler footage, I think it's because of World War II. It like the effects of World War II are still being felt, and it was psychology gone wrong isn't even getting anywhere close to it. But I think there's so many things. It's like World War II is like one of the most complicated things to really understand, and the only thing one thing more complicated than it is World War One, and it's complicated even how those two relate and how those have set the stage for so much of the kind of modern era of the last like 100 years or whatever. Yeah, I find it endlessly fascinating, but I'll just let this video finish up.
expresses itself is through parapraxis. Parapraxis are commonly known as Freudian slips of the pen and tongue, brought about by intrusions of an unconscious desire, conflict, or thought. It is like an error in speech or memory or physical action that is interpreted as occurring due to the interference of an unconscious subdued wish or internal train of thought. Usually socially embarrassing, these slips can nevertheless point to aspects of the unconscious that require further exploration and expression. In confronting the shadow, Jung isn't promoting being pretentious or arrogant. Instead, he encourages awareness and mastery over the powers of darkness. When we must deal with problems, we instinctively resist trying the way that leads through obscurity and darkness. We wish to hear only of unequivocal results and completely forget that these results can only be brought about when we have ventured into and emerged again from the darkness. But to penetrate the darkness, we must summon all the powers of enlightenment that consciousness can offer. However, as Jung alludes to in the above quote, confronting the shadow is extremely difficult, let alone harnessing its power. Most cannot and will not admit that deep down they are not wholly virtuous, selfless, and good human beings, but instead contain selfish, destructive, amoral, and immoral impulses and capacities. Most people would rather deceive themselves with a blind optimism about the goodness of their nature, and according to Jung, will thus remain a fragmented individual, as it is only by becoming conscious of and integrating the shadow that one achieves wholeness. What is especially interesting is the idea that the shadow contains not just destructive and evil aspects of personality, but also harbors potent, creative, and powerful capabilities. The shadow, when it is realized, is the source of renewal. The new and productive impulses cannot come from established values of the ego. When there is an impasse and sterile time in our lives, despite an adequate ego development, we must look into the dark. hitherto unacceptable side which has been at our conscious disposal. This brings us to the fundamental fact that the shadow is the door to our individuality, insofar as the shadow renders us our first view of the unconscious part of our personality. It represents the first stage toward meeting the self. There is in fact no access to the unconscious and to our own reality but through the shadow. Only when we realize the part of ourselves which we have not hitherto seen or preferred not to see can we proceed to question and find the sources from which it feeds and the basis on which it rests.
That's awesome. Epic quote. That was a crazy quote. So good. Bandit rants in the house. Okay. Keep clicking on that. I gotta get back to. Sorry, I got off my slide because I was when that video started, I was trying to look up what that guy's name was. From the standpoint of the psychology of the personality. So this presentation is a little bit different than a lot of the ones I do. Like I don't often just read point by point. But what I did with this is I did a review of this chapter, Aion, the Phenomenology of Self. And so I kind of found a bunch of what I found in the chapter is like all the key points, and then kind of found artwork and stuff like that to go with it. So it's a lot more straight quotes, but I'm trying to give you the feel of the book here. From the standpoint of the psychology of the personality, a twofold division ensues: an extra conscious psyche whose contents are personal, and an extra conscious psyche whose contents are impersonal and collective. So if you see okay, so let's just take a pause and look at the picture for a second. So the outside world, there's the physical world, it's like a society, people, objects, whatever. Then there's like our mask, the persona. Then there's who we feel when we feel like we're like, say, at a party around people and we don't feel totally comfortable and we're acting a bit fake or something. It's like what, and you feel like you're acting a bit fake. Like who's feeling that you're acting a bit fake? You're feeling like you're doing something. Your ego's noticing your persona, and that, but that there's this like, so look at this image. It's actually pretty complex, and then there's this personal unconscious, and in our personal unconscious mind is where these complexes, and I've been using this word complexes to mean these like repressed energies and these unconscious energies. And then here's the idea is that, it's interesting how this diagram has it drawn. But this idea of like there's a collective unconscious. And so Jung, this is a hard idea. And Jung was really interested in even things like cave paintings, right? And why like people in different parts of the world had similar cave paintings, and were they having similar either ceremonially induced hallucinations or dreams? Were they tapping into some shared visual experience? And if they were, what does that mean about the brain and the mind and consciousness? Is it, because you can kind of see where this is going, is it not localized? Is it not, can we share dream space? That's not how he would have said it. He would have called it the collective unconscious. Freud said that there was an unconscious. Jung says, well, maybe there's a piece of it that is not personal. Right? So collective just meaning not personal at a certain level. The first group, personal conscious, comprise contents which are integral components of the individual personality, and therefore just as well and therefore just as well be conscious. The second group, collective unconscious, forms, as it were, an omnipresent, which that's an intense word, exists everywhere always, unchanging, and everywhere identical quality or substrate of the psyche, a shared aspect of mind, a shared layer of mind. This is one of Jung's most, like one of his big ideas, the collective unconscious. And this became a big part of his branch, which is called, considered, I think, actually the third Venetian or Viennese from Vienna, Viennese. I say that I can't say that word. That's like one of my tongue twisters. But in Vienna is where the school of psychoanalysis is, and that's where Freud's psychoanalytic institute is. And Freud's the first school. And I knew I was going to mess that up, and I almost just bailed and went around that. And I tried it, and I messed it up. Freud is one, Adler's two, and Jung is three. And the third school is analytic psychology. I should like to emphasize that the integration of the shadow or the realization of the personal unconscious marks the first stage in the analytic process. So, and what's the analytic process is like what Jung's trying to do in his attempt for self-actualization or whatever, the therapeutic process. And without it, a recognition of Anima and Animus is impossible. So what he's saying is like, basically, the Anima and Animus lives in the collective unconscious. We haven't gotten to that yet, but we'll get there in a sec. And then the shadow is in the personal unconscious. These like kind of personalized, because it's like whatever negative experience you've had or I've had, they're not the same. The shadow is unique, personalized according to Jung. This is all according to Jung. The Anima Animus is collective, shared. And that with all of these unconscious things, their power grows in proportion to the degree to which they remain unconscious. That's a great quote, and I didn't say it perfect. Their power grows in proportion to the degree that they remain unconscious, right? And so part of the therapeutic process, I've said this already, but this is like a key point about Jung, that when we have these buried emotions, that when we can like find a way to express them or process them, or whether it's, and he was big into things like art, therapeutic expression of different forms, and it can like release the control of those energies and those angsts have on us. So with a presentation on Jung, it just goes from like a kind of tough to explain topic to the next. Anima and Animus. Remember, Jung has this fascination also with Greek and kind of Greco-Roman stories and legend. The shadow motif or theme is as well known to mythology as Anima and Animus. It represents first and foremost the personal unconscious. So I think I said that a little bit earlier, this piece of it. But so the shadows are all unique, and so therefore its contents can be made conscious without too much difficulty, like through some therapeutic process, maybe through hypnosis, maybe through dream analysis, all these kind of Jungian processes, parapraxis. In this, it differs from Anima and Animus. For where the shadow, I have the wrong four there, sorry. For where the shadow can be seen through and recognized fairly easily, the Anima and Animus are further away from consciousness, and in normal circumstances are seldom, if ever, realized. So it's like to use this term layer of mind, it's a deeper layer of mind. Anima and Animus represent functions which filter experience. So this idea of this, like, that it filters the contents of the collective unconscious through the conscious mind. And I know you're sitting there like, Mike, can you give us like a artistic interpretation of what you're talking about here, and I thought you'd never ask.
In the early 1910s, Carl Jung had been plagued for days and days by a voice in his head. He felt like he was going insane. This voice wasn't even his own. It was the voice of a woman that he knew in his professional life.
It'll all come to pass. You must accept it.
She was a Dutch psychologist who always argued with him that repairing people's minds was not a science.
This is art, my dear.
And so Jung sat down and wrestled with this experience, night after night. He tried to use the knowledge.
So he's trying to remember. Jung had this like really intense period where he totally went into himself, had this kind of mental break, came out with a lot of his theories after it, and would have these really intense, he called it active imagination, almost like awake dreaming, daydreaming to the most structured and extreme. And he would have these active imagination experiences, and he was recording everything, and he was psychoanalyzing himself the whole time and analyzing his dreams and trying to get at this, like, what is he? So Jung isn't just like I think that's another thing, is like Jung's not like preaching at everyone about what they are at a certain point. He's like, I guess he is to an extent, but he's like, I think it helps to understand him to know that he's trapped in this, not trapped, but like possessed by this desire to understand what the mind is. Yeah. Uber Boyo clips. This is a cool video, very interesting, different than any of the other videos I use. So I'm just going to go full screen because this is kind of a more artistic one.
Of psychoanalysis to figure out what was wrong. Perhaps my unconscious is forming a personality that isn't me, but is insisting on coming through into expression. This fits perfectly with my scientific training.
No, stop! Stop insulting me.
It's just a voice in my head. It's not unusual. Socrates had a voice in his head. Aquinas had a voice in his head. This is no different. They could speak with theirs. They could have a dialogue. Okay. Who are you, and why have you been bothering me the past few nights?
What do you mean, bothering? You've spent years
Where
in the
am I?
recesses of your mind, pondering and planning to write a great work, which will impress them.
What is happening?
You want them to revere you like they revere Nietzsche and Goethe. You want to do this with your science. You want to take slow, safe steps and follow the respected way. Yet, I could help you do it if you only let me in. But you treat me as an object you can study from a safe distance, as if you are terrified of me. But I am the source of revelation.
Wait, 1 second. Who are you?
Carl, I am your soul. And you've been very disrespectful.
Wait. You have to be joking with me. This is crazy.
What? Ask yourself if you think I am joking. You already understand enough. The knowledge is already within you. You just need to transform it into life. You need to live the new way.
I thought she released me. I was finally gifted a calm night's sleep, but as I drifted off into rest, I was informed by the deepest spirit within me that the next night I would begin my descent into the underworld.
So I've shown that to live classes, and I've shown that to classes on Zoom too. Actually, wait a sec. No, I've only shown it to classes that I was doing live on Zoom. I don't think that's a relatively new video. I don't think I've shown it like in person. But yeah, everybody always finds that one a bit weird. But remember, this is like, that's a trying to be an artistic description, not necessarily of what Anima and Animus is in general, but how Jung's experience of it and where he basically came up with this idea. He had this like, whether you want to use the word hallucinogenic or visionary experience. Carl Jung, interesting person. I'm going to end this first part because I think I'm at about an hour and 5 minutes, and I think it was decent. I think you're gonna have to forgive me a little bit if I get like tongue tied a couple times or like I'm a little bit awkward, don't have a good transition because I'm gonna try to do these in this stream yard because I think I'm gonna learn this system pretty good in a few more tries. But I hope this video is okay. I hope it turns out quality wise. And again, I'm recording this. This is like today for me. It's like May 10th. But I know I just made out this is the same day that I made that video with like the computer sound at the beginning doing the update. So yeah, part 2 coming soon. Cheers. Here comes the outro. Stay well. Take care.